Hello, everyone. You're watching the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center channel. My name is Elizaveta Fokht. I'm a journalist focusing on diplomacy and international relations, as we all are these days, I guess. Today, we have a very special guest for you. It's Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center director and expert in international relations and one of the leading sinologists in Russia, Alexander Gabuev. Alexander, welcome. Welcome to this conversation.
That's a very generous introduction, Lisa. Thank you so much. I'm glad to be with you.
Today we'll be discussing a lot of things, mainly the developments on the diplomatic scene, this new rise of temperature in the relationship between Russia and the United States, the European stance, the possibility of a peace deal, and the possible end of the war in Ukraine. But first, please subscribe to Carnegie Russian Eurasia Center channel. Give this video a like to help this channel grow. And of course, make sure to follow Alexander Gabuev on social media. All links are going to be available in this video description. So a lot of things happened last week. I think it's been tectonic in a way to the way we think about this world, to the way we think about how international relations work. But I think first, I want to start with what we saw in Saudi Arabia this week. Russia and the United States had their first major contact in years. The diplomatians, consisting of top diplomats from both countries, met to potentially discuss a possible summit between President Putin and President Trump. So I want to start with asking you, Alexander, what do you think about this meeting? What do you think about its results? And do you think we became any closer to an enduring peace in Ukraine?
The headline would be that it's very substantial and very important. There is a lot of things that we don't know, but there is also a lot of things that we know already, and we can just unpack them for our viewers. I think that we may be much closer to cessation of hostilities and destruction in Ukraine, but I'm not sure that we are closer to a durable peace that will address all the root causes of this horrible war, despite the rhetorics. And the chances of resumption of hostilities some years down the road are not slim, but that will depend on the deal that will be agreed. We'll see about that. I think that yesterday's meeting in Riyadh was culmination of some effort, and a lot of events have unfolded last week, but they were carefully prepared. We have indications that the Russian team started to talk to Team Trump immediately after the election. The Americans were not very public about this, reminding each other about the fate of Trump's first national security advisor, General Flynn, who was later charged of talking to Russian ambassador Sergei Kislyak and trying to establish channel outside of the State Department, like the regular practice that was, in his view, possessed by the deep state and anti-Trump elements in the previous Obama administration. So this time they have been just disciplined, discreet, and playing below radar. And it became clear that after the inauguration, this contacts have intensified. Trump had his national security advisor that didn't need Senate confirmation, Mike Waltz, talking to the head of the Russian intelligence, Sergei Naryshkin. There are probably other channels. And conversations between senior Russian and American officials have been happening throughout this war. Naryshkin saw former director of the CIA, Bill Burns, in Turkey. There have been video calls, but it was all about incident management, swaps of prisoners, just very kind of calm negotiations about how to not make things even worse. This time around, it's really about stopping the war and, in parallel, which is very important, improving U.S.-Russia relationship. And the sequence that these tracks go in parallel, it's not that the U.S. wants to stop the war and that's the precondition for improving their relationship. It's not at all. It's like they want to achieve both simultaneously. And actually, the Russian approach to kind of pack this improvement of relationship into a shiny object out there for Donald Trump, and then Ukraine is a stumbling block that needs to be fixed to achieve these goals. I think that approach has been working. So what do we know? They spent nearly 5 hours together, 5 men at the table, director of the CIA, the Secretary of State, and Trump's national security advisor. And on the Russian side, Minister of Foreign Affairs Sergei Lavrov and presidential aide for foreign policy, Yuri Ushakov, both very seasoned diplomats. 5 hours, no interpretation, both speak very good English. I think it's pretty substantial, and it's not about exchanging pleasantries. They agreed that they will set up bilateral groups to address Ukraine, improving the relationship, like fixing all of the stumbling blocks, including the size of the embassies, the personnel. You remember that this were a wave of mutual expulsions of diplomats, and the embassies have been downsized. So that will be addressed. And then the third track, improving economic ties and exploring opportunities. This is all happening in parallel. Not that we first stop your brutal invasion and then we talk about like carrots. No, it's happening again in parallel tracks. And then they discussed the summit meeting for President Putin and Donald Trump, which probably will not happen next week, but will happen most likely soon. And Europe, Ukraine, not at the table at all. And I think even if that doesn't result in kind of the outcome of the war that Russia has hoped for to get the deal, and we can talk about that in a second, but I think that the sheer optics of that and the fracturing of transatlantic unity and unity between Ukraine and the United States, which has been there throughout the war and in anticipation of the war, I think that's a remarkable gift to Vladimir Putin that he can happily pocket, that will be lasting impact. And, well, what a lucky politician, I would say.
We're definitely going to talk more about this, about how lucky Vladimir Putin is. But you mentioned, the names of people who were in this room. I wanted to ask you, what do you actually think about this? Because for years, we've been watching how the role of Russian diplomats in the system kept diminishing and diminishing and diminishing. And you mentioned yourself, when Putin really wanted to get, things done, as well, I think it also applies to the White House, to the U.S. administrations, we saw contacts between Bill Burns and Sergei Naryshkin, like head of intelligence. And here, again, for the first time in years, we see diplomats talking to each other. So do you think their conversation was more technical and they were just trying to arrange a summit? Do you think it was more substantial? Do you think that these people, and I'm not only talking about Ushakov and Lavrov, I'm talking about Rubio, Waltz as well. Do you think they, represent their leaders in a way that they're allowed to speak for them, to, make their position clear? Do you think that they're allowed to engage in real negotiations other than discussing technicalities?
I think that the Russian side is pretty strong. I know that people like to dismiss Russian diplomats and Sergei Lavrov in particular, but here he is in the role of presidential envoy. He has mandate to negotiate. He is a very seasoned diplomat and skilled negotiator. You have experienced him. I have been working on his press corps for a number of years. He can be charming if he wants to. He can be intimidating when he wants to. And so is Ushakov. Ushakov is a little bit more kind of cold and less warm in his personal style. But nevertheless, he's been ambassador to the U.S. for a decade. He's not an American watcher by training. He's more a Scandinavia person, but he has developed a network there. And he's been around since Vladimir Putin prime minister stint. So he's been there next to the boss for quite some time. So I think that these are very experienced people. They are good negotiators, and they've been given this mandate by Putin. And that's what counts. I wouldn't speculate why Naryshkin was not officially at the table, but he was involved kind of in the back office of the Russian negotiation team before. And then I would also note presence of Kirill Dmitriev, not at the table because he kind of is not somebody who is appointed to this. but he has his own track with President Trump's special envoy, Witkov. And we know that Kirill Dmitriev is first a very experienced and consummate schmoozer. He has ties to Trump's family through Kushner. He also has ties to the Saudi royal family, to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and he's also a very useful tool. So, to my mind, the Russian team comes with a good game plan, and it's a game plan that has flexibility and agility. They have plan A, plan B, and plan C, and we can talk about that. But there are also a lot of preparation, reading the profiles of the people, and their goal, to my mind, is to bring about the personal summit of Trump and Putin, to get them into one room as soon as possible, because that's where the Russians hope to sway President Trump. And I think based on everything, what we are seeing coming out of the president's mouth and of his kind of team, there are only two readings of that. One is that President Trump is very skillfully understanding that multilateral negotiations of this complex issue just could fail, because if you have everybody in the room, that's not very productive. So you need to talk to the main adversary first, flatter him, get him like a little bit more open to negotiate, and then you just impose what you want and then make some compromises. So it's very smart negotiation tactics in order to kind of get what the U.S. wants. And that's a deal that's beneficial to Ukraine as well. And then the other reading is that President Trump is just swayed by President Putin. There is this shiny, lofty goal of improving ties with the Russians. And Ukraine is not so important to President Trump, and he's actually ready to kind of throw Ukraine under the bus. It's not as principled as it was for President Biden. And to me, if you put together all of President Trump's comments, including his comments recently that Ukraine is to blame for the war and they should have a better deal, and President Zelensky has a 4% approval rating. I don't know where President Trump gets these figures, probably in the same source where he gets that the U.S. has spent $350 billion on supporting Ukraine, or that he can tariff Russia to kind of force it to the negotiation table. Well, you tariff all the $3 billion of U.S.-Russia trade, you get a lot. I think, to me, it's more likely that the Russians are succeeding in kind of getting under President Trump's skin and convincing him that he really should pursue this, improving ties of Russia at the expense of Ukraine. And that's what we are seeing.
You mentioned Russian game plan during those talks. What do you think this game plan is? Because Vladimir Putin has been saying since the last summer, I think, about his goals in Ukraine, and they're quite grand. He wants other countries to formally recognize the territories that Russia took from Ukraine as Russian. He wants other countries to leave sanctions against Russia. He wants Ukraine to, give guarantees that it's not going to join NATO, and for NATO to formally reject Ukraine. Those goals are quite big. And for now, especially given what President Trump said yesterday, as you mentioned about Zelensky's rating, that Russia seems to be controlling the narrative, but maybe, as I think it often is with diplomacy, it's much more difficult it is. So what do you think Russian goal is, what goals they're trying to achieve, and what is the plan to achieve them, and what can American use as a tool to maybe move their agenda forward during those talks?
Disclaimer, I don't have a crystal ball. I was not a digital fly on the wall during the talks, and I cannot read Putin's mind, and definitely cannot read Trump's mind.
Sadly.
For sure. Maybe I sleep better because I can't do that. But I think that we have a lot of experience watching these people. We know some of the players personally for quite some time, so that allows us to make educated guesses of what's happening. I think that Russia has 3 battle plans for this negotiation. It's plan A, plan B, and plan C. The overarching attempt of what we are seeing is to convince President Trump that improvement of ties with Russia is a worthy goal in itself, that's important to pursue Trump's foreign policy agenda to make America great again. And Vladimir Putin can be a very useful partner in that. So he needs to recruit Vladimir Putin, and then this partnership will be a gift that keeps on giving on multiple domains. And then Ukraine is just stumble block. So you need to solve it ASAP on Putin's terms, de facto, with Putin offering minor concessions. The Russians have a battle plan for this negotiation. That's plan A, plan B, and plan C. They are trying to position relationship with Russia as a goal that Trump should pursue, that this partnership will be a gift that keeps on giving on Trump's foreign policy agenda, and that Ukraine is just a stumbling block to unlock this beautiful partnership with Russia that no other US president could in modern history. And Trump will be this guy who really knows how to deal with the Russians. And that for this, you need to solve Ukraine on Putin's terms, with Putin offering minor concessions. Understanding of Russian thinking of the timeline is key. They believe that overall, the battlefield momentum is favorable to them, that they have a militarily advantage over Ukraine, and that in the next year, time is on the Russian side. So if they don't get this negotiation, what they want through negotiation with Trump, they get it on the battlefield and they put Ukraine into a miserable position. And that Ukraine just doesn't have the same resources as Russia has in the next 12 months, and that the situation is critical. So maybe over time, in 2-3 years, Russia's economic and military, particularly manpower, equipment position will deteriorate. But in the short time, they will push hard as possible. Why are they then dealing with Trump? Why are they not kind of postponing this negotiation to wait? Because they understand that Trump wants a quick deal. That's a priority for him. Whatever it is, he wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He wants just claps. He wants to solve this because he really thinks that it's solvable quickly. But he wants a quick deal. And for the speed of the deal, he is ready to sacrifice the quality of the deal if it's viewed from kind of transatlantic traditional perspective.
And you think it suits Russia?
Yes. Trump wants to have quick deal. And then if the Russians believe that Trump wants quick and dirty deal, right? So speedy deal with concessions to the Russians, it's definitely worth pursuing, because then you not only have a maybe not totally perfect deal, but deal that benefits you well. You have Ukraine in a gradual state of implosion, and you are in Trump good graces for the next 4 years. And then you can get a lot of concessions. So to me, reading Trump's kind of post in his social network and everything what he says since, the Russians have been framing this as, look, President Trump, there was this beautiful partnership after World War II, that we defeated Nazis, we sacrificed a lot, we fought together. And then we are white, conservative values, Western civilization that was alienated by horrible people like President Obama and President Biden. And because these people have been so stupid, I'm not imitating Trump, but I'm trying to think what the Russians could have said. This partnership was destroyed. We're all the way we wanted to be America's partner. And there are so many things that we can do together. So first, we have this responsibility for nuclear arms, and that's the traditional Russian point, arms control. We don't want this war to go kaboom. We want safety. Then you have this kind of deal that you chase with Zelensky about 500 billion worth of rare earth and other natural resources. But first, bulk of these resources is under Russian control in Donbass, which is a true story. And then why would you look only at this 500 billion where you can unlock, let's say, 10 trillion partnership with the Russians? There are so many projects in the Arctic that we don't have technology to do because of the stupid sanctions. And we've thought all the time that ExxonMobil and other American companies could come and help us develop these resources. So there is 350 billion of lost revenues. And that's what Kirill Dmitriev was parroting. So all of these narratives, like just using these commercial goals and so on, are really the language that Trump understands. And I'm sure that the Russians have put that on the table that, this is lost revenue. That's stupid. Joe Biden, have lost to American economy. And then all of the praise about, if not this stolen election in 2020, then this war would never have happened, is all music to Trump's ear. And he's already parroting this narrative. And then also castigating Zelensky as not a friend of President Trump. Oh, you know what? Because of your phone call, your impeachment nearly happened. This investigation, like all of this is bad for you, and he shouldn't be trusted. I think that approach, based on what we hear from President Trump, starts to work. And then you picture this, and then also there is one element that, Russia will move away from China because Putin likes Xi Jinping, but not that he feels comfortable. And that's already repeated by J.D. Vance and Mike Waltz. Like all of these people are talking about this. So you can portray that, and then you say, okay, here is Ukraine. You mentioned the lofty goals that Putin has put forward, but he was also saying last year in Vietnam that, that's maybe an ultimatum, but people need to negotiate with me and we can come to an agreement. And then it's Zelensky who banned himself to talk to Putin. So I could see an agreement with a ceasefire along the current line of contact minus Kursk. So he would not claim the 4 regions that are part of the Russian constitution. And he would say okay, we want to recognize them as Ukraine. They want to recognize our territory as kind of permanent Russian possession. And it's fine. We just want to stop bloodshed and kill brotherly nations and lose our soldiers and so on. So we can have a ceasefire. And then to guarantee the ceasefire, actually what we had in Minsk is maybe enough. So definitely no Western boots on the ground. And that's what Lavrov was saying. It actually worked. It was a good observation, like unarmed OAC monitors, because Zelensky violated that and Biden violated that. And with you in charge, this is a good enough mechanism. So if the hostilities stop, and then we can talk about that in a second, whether cessation of hostilities before everything else is agreed is beneficial to the Russians. And then Ukraine has elections and all of that. And we ensure that Ukraine doesn't go to NATO. You probably walk back the promise that George Bush gave and NATO gave in Bucharest Summit Declaration 2008. And then, you ensure the rights of the Russian speakers, the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And then that's settled. And we talk about other issues later. That's a good enough deal. Why? Because it sets Ukraine on a gradual implosion course. There will be no meaningful security guarantee. The Russians, I forgot about one important thing. The Russians want to disarm Ukraine to an extent, like stuff that they're discussing in Istanbul, like limits to Ukrainian army. They definitely want to dismantle Ukrainian long-range program to create these drones and missiles. Like that needs to stop, and flow of Western weapon and training to Ukraine needs to stop. If they can ensure that, everybody in Ukraine will realize that the country is not protected. It's basically Vladimir Putin's word that he takes back all the time if he chooses to. And Russia could reinvade because Russia will go back and reconstitute its military. With that, Ukraine really remains unprotected. And once the martial law is over, there will be election. That will be very polarizing. A lot of money will be spent on election, not on defense. We don't know what will happen there, but the Russians, I think, will hope to get president other than Vladimir Zelensky, who's now a personal enemy because of all of the things he said about Putin, and you want to get rid of him. But also the Russians will either hope to get a more pragmatic pro-Russian president, which I think is an illusion, or at least to get a new leadership with much weakened mandate and political polarization in Ukraine. You would also have most likely outflow of people, because whether Ukrainian women and children will come back to the country from the track to citizenship and good schools in Europe that many of them are on, or rather their husbands will join them in Europe, I think it's an open question. And there are high chances that there will be flows in both directions. But the Russians can meaningfully hope that the flow out of Ukraine will be bigger than flow of returnees. And with that, no investment will also come to Ukraine because there will be no meaningful reconstruction. Why would you invest in building something in Ukraine where in 3 years, in 4 years, the Russian missiles can destroy these objects again. And with that, Ukraine in a state of implosion, sanctions withdrawal, and so on, Russia would have a lot of resources to reconstitute. I think that's the game plan. Whether the ceasefire before everything is agreed works for the Russians or for Ukrainians, we don't know. I think the Russian calculus for now was that nothing will be agreed and cessation of hostilities will not be given to Ukrainians before everything is agreed and put on paper and sealed. And the calculation is that once the guns are silent, the West has resources to kind of pump more defensive capabilities into Ukraine, weapons, munitions. Ukrainians can fix their manpower problem. And I think that's been the kind of major scenario for the Russians. So we will talk while at the same time we fight, and then Ukraine gets gradually defeated. And that's the scenario of Korean War. I think this calculus might be changing to an extent because the Russians realize that the deal to be signed soon, that's like this idea is sinking in Ukraine. And that's very demoralizing for people at the battlefield and for people who are to be mobilized into Ukrainian armed forces. Because if the deal is to be reached very soon, there is no way that Ukraine can fight without the US support and the Europeans will fall in line with Trump. And if it will be a deal that's not beneficial to Ukraine, why would you be there to die like as last casualty of this war when tomorrow things will be over and your sacrifice would be absolutely in vain? And we have the opposite trend now in Russia, where you hear reports, I think that you work on this a lot, Lisa, that inmates in prison were suddenly kind of showing more enthusiasm to be recruited. And people get this contract signed because they expect that war will be over soon. So prisoners will get, all of this presidential pardon and some money and so on. And then they get to the front lines and then the war is over. Civilians who kind of go into the army ranks will get all of these lavish payments and all of the bonuses that comes with the status. And then the war will be over. So they don't need to fight. And I think this imbalance of manpower probably creates a room for the Russians to consider ceasefire before everything is agreed.
So you just described what you call Plan A, but I think before we move to Plan B and C, I have another question, and maybe Plans B and C, maybe they cover it. So people who watch it might be asking themselves and us too, like, wait, hold on a minute. You're getting very much ahead of, yourselves, and Trump and Putin, they haven't met yet, and there are many, many things that could go wrong, and you and I, we've seen many attempts to repair, U.S. Russia bilateral relationship over those years. There was this famous reset button. And when Trump first came to the White House, I think there were certain expectations that those relationship might improve. And we saw it didn't really. And there were actually even more sanctions than with the previous administrations, Obama's administration. So what can go wrong? And do you think the possibility of it all going wrong maybe somehow can be applied to Plan B and Plan C could be covered by them?
That's exactly what is covered in my vision of Plan B and Plan C. So Plan A envisages that some deal can be achieved that leads to Ukrainian implosion and withdrawal of sanctions and better ties with the US for the next
And you just described the outlines of those deals.
Yes. Right. And then the Plan A envisages that this deal can actually be rammed down Ukrainian and European throats, and it will be accepted because Trump kind of imposes that on them. If Trump agrees to the deal, but then the Europeans and Zelensky say, oh, we're going to fight, we don't take it, and there's going to be a flow of European weapons and so on. Plan B envisages that Trump needs to be persuaded that it's because of the Europeans and Zelensky that this deal fell apart. It was not implemented. And then Putin say, oh, Donald, we agreed on everything. I'm sorry, but I need to continue the fighting. And that President Trump will be very angry at Ukrainians and Europeans, and he will withdraw American support from Ukraine. He will say like, okay, If you don't want my peace, you will deal that with the Russians yourself. Like, I'm quitting. Like, there is no way I can waste American taxpayers' money on this senseless conflict. And he removes American training, American equipment, American financial support, American intelligence sharing, American blessing to use US intelligence for striking targets inside Russia. And with that, we'll see how much Storm Shadows and Scalps the UK and French missiles can really do damage if the US stops supporting those strikes. And then he pulls the US out. And people will see how actually much the US was doing to support Ukraine. I think that no country can really replace the US in this role. And if people think that the Europeans can do something equal to the US contribution, they are delusional. Well, the Europeans can definitely step in and do more. And probably if Ukraine gets its act together on manpower, they can hold Russia at the position where Russia makes some gradual advances at the prohibitive costs over the long time. But the immediate withdrawal of US support will be really painful for Ukraine. So that's plan B. Plan C could envisage that Trump, for some reason, actually cares about kind of worthy security guarantees for Ukraine. That he actually says, no, wait a minute. We will continue to support Ukraine in terms of building deterrence by denial. We want Ukraine to buy American weapons. We want Europeans to buy it for Ukraine. We will provide training, and we are interested in meaningful separation of the warring parties. So OEC mission will not fly. We want to have a real peacekeeping force, Russia. And with that, like, they will give resources for Ukraine to kind of have meaningful, viable state, minus the territories they lost and minus NATO membership. And that's not the deal that the Russians can take, I think, because Putin is concerned that if you have a shield of European security forces as peacekeepers, behind this shield, the West, like Trump departs in 4 years, you will have, I don't know, Gavin Newsom, whoever is the Democratic president, Jake Sullivan as Secretary of State, a lot of people from the previous administration who are angry at Russia, a lot of people who want kind of Ukraine to return to its 1991 border or whatever it is. But let's say in 10 years, Ukraine is technologically much more superior to Russia because of Western help. It has very combat-ready armed forces. Sanctions are not removed. And then President Kirill Budanov, or whoever that is, says we are on liberating Crimea, right? We go in. And that's what Russia has experienced recently in Syria with Erdogan, who kept this kind of protecting bubble in Idlib province, nurtured HTS, and then they were unleashed against the Assad regime and it fell in a matter of 11 days. Putin was this kind of fake peacekeeper in Azerbaijan, in Nagorno-Karabakh, where they probably agreed on something with President Aliyev. President Aliyev moved in and then removed 100,000 ethnic Armenians into Armenia and has reclaimed Nagorno-Karabakh. So he knows that the guys who are NATO forces, who are involved in helping Ukraine, who are training Ukrainians, and like some of them maybe are in the fight with no kind of insignia as volunteers and so on, like, why would you trust them with being peacekeepers? And he will fight to prevent this outcome. If that's the case, the Russian plan C is to continue the fighting, because the Russians calculate, I think rightly, that it's very unlikely that the Americans and Europeans will enter the fight and send boots to the ground when the conflict is ongoing. Like, there is no Western public that can support that. President Biden was not ready to give that because it can lead to a conventional war between Russia and NATO that ultimately turns into a nuclear war, and then humanity is gone. So Trump is very clear-cut about this. And with that, the Russian calculus is that in the current fighting, the momentum is on the Russian side because the Ukrainians cannot fix their manpower issue. Their morale is weakened. Well, it's situational along various parts of the front line, probably Azov knows why it's fighting and why kind of killing more Russians is a noble goal worth pursuing. But in other parts of the front, we know that some of the units are withdrawing without orders and so on. And the Russians hope that in 12 months next, Russia will bring Ukraine to a much more difficult situation that Ukrainians will have to sue for peace in the way that that happened in 2015 with the second Minsk agreements. And that in the short term, all of the tools of Trump, promised to unleash against Russia, they will take time to materialize and they will be not efficient because Russia has this resiliency for the next 12 months. So I think that's more or less what the Russians are thinking when they're going into this negotiation.
Do you think that Americans are prepared for Plan B or even Plan C, which is, as you said, continuation of this war?
They say that there are tools to kind of put Russia in a weaker position and unleash, sanctions, tariffs, and so on. But just the war tariffs in relation to Russia is weird. Again, because U.S.-Russia trade is just $3 billion. You can tariff it 500%. Like Russia won't feel the pain at all. If they kind of beef up the sanctions regime, that might be biting. But again, couple of months down the road, 12 months down the road, and we don't know whether Ukraine really has the time. Well, it could, in theory. Like Ukraine is not without agency, and Europeans can step in. But like manpower is the critical issue at the front lines right now. And then looking at what Elon Musk does with the civilian service, like how many people are still in OFAC in the treasury, how many people in the intelligence community will focus on sanctions enforcement, we don't know. So in theory, Americans may think about those issues, but from everything what we hear in Washington, D.C., it doesn't look like it, unfortunately. So maybe Plan B. So they want to deal with the Russians, and they will be very angry at Ukrainians if that deal collapses. But Plan C on how to really bring Ukraine into a meaningful position to negotiate an imperfect deal that will not get back the territory, that will not get Ukraine into NATO, because that's what even President Biden was not ready to give, but will create this credible deterrent force by denial that will increase the cost of potential invasion or continuation of war for Russia to prohibitive levels. For that, you need time and you need patience. It's not going to be a quick deal. And if Trump wants a quick deal, unfortunately, he will not get a high quality deal that protects Ukrainian interests.
What about lowering energy prices, oil prices? Because President Trump, I think, has mentioned several times that could be a tool to force Russia to negotiate with the U.S. and Ukraine.
I think that the best person to ask is my colleague Sergei Vakulenko. So I will put my Sergei Vakulenko hat for a second. And I hope that there will be chances to invite him to this channel and talk about this as well. But here's the thing. Russian break-even starts at about 20-25 US dollars price. That's the price at the port. So everything above, let's say 25, that's where Russia starts to earn money. And break-even that makes sense for American shale oil producers is in the 50, 60 range, right? It's rather 60 than 50. So bringing down the price to 50 still creates a lot of room for Russia to play. Yes, it's reduced cash flow, but it's still a pretty sizable cash flow. And it puts the American producers into a position where it doesn't make sense for them. Well, Trump says, we will lower taxes and so on, but the U.S. oil industry is not very taxed. So there is not that much room there. And if you want to subsidize, like if you really want to pay from the budget 10 US dollars to 60, and then bring down the oil price, that goes against his kind of budget strategy that was outlined by Secretary of Treasury. And that is also just very hard to find money for. And then, okay, there is another option on how to deal with lower oil prices, is to remove the Russian oil, through sanction enforcement, and then ask Saudi Arabia to drill more and pump more to the oil market. So you keep the high price and you replace the Russian 7 million barrels a day with Saudi 7 barrels a day. But I think that Saudi Arabia has reason to be skeptical about that. First of all, they want to keep some part of their potential production to offset any future kind of unexpected disruptions to the global oil market. That's been the policy of the kingdom for many years. And then 7 million barrels a day is pretty sizable amount. That's not that easy to replace. And then finally, since the Russians will be able to provide that with a discount to Chinese entities, to Indian entities, that's too lucrative share for other players not to pursue. We've seen that with Iran, right? Iranian oil is banned from the global oil markets, but Iran still sells it and still has a cash flow. So the Russians will definitely find a way to sell it to the Chinese through all of the sanctioned tankers. It will be diminished cash flow, but not a cash flow that won't exist.
So let's, unlike Presidents Trump and Putin, bring other players to this conversation and start with Europe. I spent the last week in Brussels and just came back from Paris, where President Macron held this very hastily, arranged meeting. You spent this very painful weekend, very painful for Europe in Munich, and I think it's safe to say that European capitals, that they're shocked, and it is indeed very painful moment for them, and it seems like they're actually very confused and don't know what to do, because we saw that the summit that was assembled by Macron led to nothing, basically. So I have two questions. First one, do you think there's anything that Europe can do to, on the one hand, help Ukraine, which is their main goal according to those European leaders, and at the same time prove both to Washington, D.C. and Moscow that they're still relevant and that they deserve a seat at this table? This is my first question. And another thing, there's a point of view which is, I'd say, very popular in Moscow, and I'm sure among Russian elite as well, that Europe actually doesn't need to be at this table, and that its involvement right now, given European position, only prolongs the war and leads to more death, more bloodshed. Do you think there's any argument that European leaders can actually make against this very strong, again, very, very popular in Russia point of view?
I think that the Europeans are interested in a deal that preserves Ukrainian sovereignty, if not territorial integrity in its international recognized border. And the consideration, which to my mind is pretty justified, is that if this deal ends, if this war ends with Ukraine not getting credible security guarantees outside of NATO and help to build conventional deterrent against future Russian invasion is good enough, probably guarantee, that will lead to a second war. And that invites more death later on, probably. And that unfortunately unlocks a scenario where Russia will feel emboldened. It is embarking on a military constitution regardless. Putin is not saying that he will change the size of military expenditures in Russia if there is a deal, right? That all of this money will spend on hospitals and educations rather on the military. So with that, couple of years down the road, if Putin gets an idea that NATO is weak and he just needs to help the Russian speakers in Narva to liberate them from horrible Estonian rule, and he launches this provocation and it takes just one, village that will not be defended, and where NATO goes into like, oh, does Article 5 apply? Do you really want to go to war with Russia? The US says like, it's your problem, Europe, you don't get involved. And then Paris and Berlin are going to call Moscow, and then NATO cannot put a credible response. That's the end of the organization. So if Putin gets this idea a couple of years down the road, how many people in the Situation Room will be saying, oh, Mr. Putin, that this is a crazy idea, we shouldn't try, right? He got away with his war in Georgia, annexation of Crimea, war in Donbass, now the second war, he chopped off 20% of Ukrainian territory. So he might test his luck. That's what Europeans are trying to prevent. And under normal U.S. administration, that definitely would be a horrible scenario for the U.S. too, because it doesn't want NATO's implosion. U.S. credibility and safety of its allies is on the line. Forget about Ukraine for a second. Like, Ukraine is outside of the tent, helping an independent democratic nation that was invaded by an authoritarian regime is kind of worthy goal, but the US is not going into the direct fight for Russia with this. But with NATO, it might, and that we are back into this Cold War question whether the US will sacrifice Manhattan for West Berlin. And I think that the US wants to avoid answering this question in real time by making the deterrence really credible. So, end of the war in Ukraine that kind of destroys Ukrainian sovereignty is really bad for European ability to deter. And I think that's where European interest is. And that's exactly opposite from what Putin wants. That's why Russia is happy that Europeans are not at the table. And we don't know about President Trump because he's so unorthodox. And from what he says, these goals that were so critical for all American administrations throughout the Cold War and later are not that important for him, right? What can Europe do?
Do they have any leverage to push their interest? Maybe with sanctions, because a lot of sanctions that are now on the table that Russia has to deal with, they come from Europe, and I think that the trade with Europe is in a way even more important for Russia than the trade with the United States, because Europe is right here on the continent. Can they use this as a leverage?
I think they can. I think that if the US goes into bilateral deal, withdraws support from Ukraine, US sanctions are dropped, and the US cannot help Ukrainians and Europeans in sanctions enforcement, then they are in a big position because Russia can survive, as we've seen, without trade with Europe. Like it's diminished prosperity to the Russian people, and some companies like Gazprom are shadow of what they used to be before the war. But Russian economy can keep going, and if the U.S., for example, investment comes in, like let's imagine that, or sanctions implementation is just not enforced, then Russia is in a stronger position. They can offer Trump a deal that's kind of in Trump's interest, and that's the language that Trump understands. They say, like, look, Ukraine needs these weapons, and we are ready to buy them from you, like $50 billion a year for the next 5 years will be purchased for us to create credible deterrence and for Ukraine. So that's a revenue stream that's realistic. It's much more realistic than Putin's promises. We are ready to give it to you. We are also ready to buy US LNG. We are ready to kind of create a deal that works for you because we are the largest democratic market in the world. And think about Russia, that's kind of less than 2% of global GDP. It's your competitor structurally, right? You have interest in removing Russian commodities from the market, not encouraging them to come in. Like you can make this kind of argument to Trump. Problem is that Ukrainian, major bottleneck for being able to resist the Russians is really manpower issue. And nobody can fix that for them. My colleagues, like I don't wear Mike Kaufman's or Dara Masiko's hat, but Mike just has been in Ukraine. He says that there are ways to fix the manpower problem. And it's about forced employment and so on. But like Ukraine is very short on time. Like they need to start fixing it now. But again, there is agency and there is stuff that can be done. In theory, if Ukraine fixes the manpower problem, well, the Europeans have money to support Ukraine. The Europeans have weapons to support Ukraine. They can, in theory, grab into the stash that their military have. And like warehouses are empty. No military is comfortable in giving what they have to Ukraine because they need it to deter the Russians. But in theory, an agreement can be achieved. And like if they buy from the US, if they buy more from South Korea, you can arrive at some arrangement. But it's much weaker than with the US at the table, both for equipment, but also intelligence sharing to me. And the organizational role is critical. No country can really replace the role that the US is playing. And then here is my question. The writing has been on the wall since April. It was clear that Trump is a very realistic possibility. It's at least a 50-50. You and I most likely have heard from European officials all of these months that, there's contingency planning that's going to be there. There is interagency work to Trump-proof the European Union and NATO and support to Ukraine. Now comes Trump, who acts what he promised on campaign trail. And I'm wondering why people are surprised that he's not acting as a responsible transatlantic president on the US, but as Donald Trump, whom we know from his first time. And there are no adults in the room, no people like Secretary Mattis or Rex Tillerson around anymore. Why people are like, this is a person that brings his agenda, his vision, and his administration is lined up with people who support this agenda. So the Europeans really need to get their act together. And we see a lot of commentary coming from people who say, like, yes, we need to de-risk in regard to the US. The problem is that Europeans are politically weak. In key countries like this country that we are currently living in, we'll go to the ballot boxes on the weekend. We'll see when the government is formed and how strong the mandate will be. In France, you have a very difficult situation after the election that President Macron called. So he was the guy who says that Europe needs to kind of Trump-proof and he can do his I told you so dance. The problem is that his party doesn't have the political mandate. UK is outside of the EU. Poland is also having internal divisions between the two parties. And like, even if Tusk's party wins the presidential election, and the executive branch is united in one hands, like, the conflict is there. So I wish to be very optimistic that Europe can get its act together, but you've been in Paris and you've seen this torturing moment. My impression from Munich is that people are very worried. The silver lining, again, is that Europe has resources and agencies to help Ukraine and definitely help itself. And we've seen that Europeans can actually do stuff that they haven't anticipated. Who would have thought in 22 that switching off Russian gas is possible for German economy and it will not crash? And yes, like, German economy is not in the best shape and the energy prices are high and it's bad for industry, but Germany manages. So you can manage that. And I think that's also very important to remember and put that in perspective.
Well, we'll see if they'll be able to, as you say, get their act together and start, instead of talking the talk, they will start walking the walk. Now I want to talk about other very important player, China. They seem to have just disappeared from the conversation completely, and we know that for quite some time they tried to act as potential mediators in this conflict. As I said in the beginning, you're an expert on China. Have you talked with the insiders recently? What do they say about what's going on? What's China's view on this warming temperature in the Russia-U.S. bilateral relationship and the cooling temperature in the U.S.-Brussels bilateral relationship?
I think that China, since the beginning of this conflict, in an awkward position because the US and Europeans tried to put China on the spot for supporting Russia. China was definitely not interested in Russian defeat that would lead to change of government in Russia. Putin or people like Putin are very beneficial because they keep Russia close as China's junior partner, increasingly on Chinese conditions. But the price is further damage to China-EU ties. And that's why they developed this peace plan. That's why they try to position themselves as a potential force for good without taking too much of responsibility, because China understands clearly that Kiev's and Moscow's position on how this war should end are miles apart. President Trump initially wanted to involve China in solving this, and he mentioned China in one of his first postings on the war that, China could play a role. And we don't know what it is. Probably he was thinking that China could put pressure on Russia because it has leverage. But since then, China has disappeared from the conversation as a tool that Trump could play. China has popped up as something that, the U.S. would be willing to bring Russia away from China. J.D. Vance talked about this to Wall Street Journal. Trump was vocal about this on the campaign trail. He, I think, talked to Tucker Carlson on one of these interviews during the campaign rallies that he will unite Russia and China. And Trump probably believes that he can get a good deal with Putin and he doesn't need to get China involved. What China is smartly trying to do is to position itself as a responsible player that advocates for European and Ukrainian interests. In Munich, Wang Yi mentioned that, oh, this war is happening in Europe. That's why Europe is absolutely needed at the table. He met Ukrainian Foreign Minister Sybiga and Chief of Staff Andriy Yermak, very powerful person in Ukrainian politics. And then the language that China uses in the official readout, like that China is interested in durable and just peace, it's the first time that China uses the Ukrainian language to talk about peace. And then in Ukrainian framing, just peace means peace with 1991 borders. Russia pays for the damage and the war criminals are tried. And then China is elusive. Like China didn't pin what it says. And like 1999 borders don't feature in that. But China is very actively trying to position itself as, somebody who advocates for European interests in this conflict without taking much responsibility. And I think that taking a back seat and waiting for Trump to further weaken EU-US ties, transatlantic relationship, seeing Europeans like interested in dealing maybe more with the Chinese, seeing Trump destroying U.S. tools of statecraft like USAID, and chasing this elusive goal of bringing Putin under kind of his wing away from China, which will not be there because no matter how much Putin will try to pocket this, carrots that Trump will produce, he knows that Trump will be out of the picture most likely in 4 years. Well, there are scenarios that are different, but I think that that's the most plausible scenario. And then who knows what happens in the U.S. domestic politics? Like trust between the U.S. and Russia is not there, where Xi Jinping is around for quite some time. And communist-led China is Russia's neighbor forever. So why would you rock the boat in any meaningful way? And I think that that gives China a lot of comfort, a lot of pleasure, and a lot of room to play a very smart, pragmatic game. You don't need to be very successful and smart. You don't need to not make mistakes. Like as President Obama put it, don't do stupid shit. And I think that China is the player that's actually pursuing this strategy.
So the last question I have for you, given what we just discussed, do you think that everything that just happened this week mean that in the reality, in the real world that we all live in, the world order hasn't changed much at all since the World War II, and it's still about the, as we say in Russia, rule of the strong? Or is it too early to draw conclusions? And where does this leave countries like Ukraine? Do you think there's any silver lining for this country? Because obviously, from what we just discussed, they're in a really, really, really tight spot right now. Is there even a chance, a promise of not a very happy future? Obviously, it's going to be very, very painful to recover from the situation. But is there any hope for what they call a just peace, a peace that could be lasting and enduring?
Well, it's a great question, and it's early in the morning, so we don't want to get each other more depressed, and like it's too early for a vodka shot or whatever it is that the Russians use to kind of discuss these questions.
Never
But
too early, though.
I'll tell you this. I think that this moment where the world order was really just and international law was not violated was not there. Like we remember what the U.S., the guardian of this international order, was doing throughout it. And I think that there is very little introspection. I think that at some point, though, the U.S. has arrived with Obama and what Biden was trying to achieve to a position that actually, you need to operate within the framework of international law and UN Charter, that violating it didn't serve U.S. purpose, didn't make this world a better and happier place. And then, unfortunately, the invasion of Iraq and everything that happened afterward gave ideas to these regimes like Vladimir Putin's Russia. And then they started to violate it. And it's like dominoes. And it's like kind of 9/11 type of events that bring further second order and third order events that make this world a much less stable place. So I think that Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Trump's presidency are adding to this instability, and we are entering a decade probably of very volatile international situation where hopefully we will avoid a major war between the great powers with involvement of weapons of mass destructions, and we will just get through it without that. But I think that it will not be forever, hopefully. We see how much this is tied to certain personalities like Vladimir Putin, and they will be out of the stage at some point, hopefully. And I think that countries like Ukraine and many other countries have a lot of internal resilience. They have agency, and they have ways to kind of improve this resilience. Ukraine has demonstrated remarkable resiliency, agility, courage, and unity throughout these years. It's not guaranteed that it will continue like that, particularly if Ukraine is left with an imperfect peace. And that's why I think that European interests, and frankly, in normal circumstances, I would think that it's America's interest to also bring Ukraine to a good position to retain its sovereignty. But we will see.
Well, on this philosophical note, we'll have to say goodbye to Alexander. This is all we have time today. For today, thank you very much for this interesting conversation. I'm sure there will be a lot to talk about in the coming days and weeks, and we'll see if there's going to be indeed a summit between President Putin and President Trump, and maybe we'll see each other again on this channel and discuss this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great being with you.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and follow the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center on social media. All links are going to be available in description. Thank you very much, and see you next time.